the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Friends, last Sunday evening, a journey which began on September 11th, 2001, ended with the death of Osama bin Laden. And as is often the case when we reach the end of a journey, we can't help but think back to the beginning. And fortunately, or unfortunately, this is a journey whose beginning most of us have no trouble remembering. The truth is, it doesn't take much for us to recall the frantic phone calls to loved ones, the images of the burning towers, or the feeling in those first days that the world had changed. We knew it. The world had changed. We realized it when we were watching the reaction of people around the world. On the one hand, we remember the goodwill which came from far and near as people set aside their grudges to mourn with us. And on the other hand, we remember the sickness in our stomachs as we saw the pictures of people rejoicing in the streets of countries with whose names we had yet to become familiar, wondering how a people could be so jaded and spiteful that they could rejoice at the news of death. And although the journey has been long and filled with noise, if we really strain, we can even still hear the words of then President Bush, "We'll meet violence with patient justice." And in that moment, at the beginning of what would be a long journey, even in the midst of our pain, there was hope. An Easter hope, if you will, that life could overcome death. But as we know, friends, journeys can be long, and memories, like promises, can fade, and in this journey there was no exception. Over this nearly decade-long journey, we found ourselves entering into two ill-conceived and, by the end, largely forgotten wars. We saw sharp divisions arise in our country regarding the way in which we treat our neighbors, and perhaps worst of all, we confused one extremist and hateful group with the entire Islamic faith, and as a result, even as Christians, we allowed ourselves, in our fear, to override our core belief that all are children of God. Which meant that by the end of our journey this week, as surprising as it may seem, we were the people rejoicing in the street over death, and the rest of the world were the ones looking on with sickness in their stomachs. The truth is, friends, this is a challenging moment. Is the world safer with Osama bin Laden gone? Probably. Should we have done what we did? To be honest, I don't know. But I do know this, that as a people of faith, we do not celebrate death. Friends, we do not celebrate death because we are a people who believe in life. We proclaim life. We rejoice in life. Are there times when death is just? Maybe. But even in those moments, we ought to be careful before we take to the streets in jubilation at the death of another person. Friends, this is why it is sometimes really hard to be a Christian. Sure, it's all fine and dandy when we talk about loving our neighbor as ourselves. our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. It's great to see one another as children of God, as people created in the image of God, but it is much, much, much harder to see terrorists and murderers in that way. But whether we like it or not, that is the call of the gospel, and it is a radical call. And perhaps what this week reminds us is that we have work to do in the journey ahead. But friends, the good news is that there is still hope. Friends, the Easter hope is still alive. The hope that from death can come new life is still with us and alive. And so today, on this third Sunday of Easter, on this day in which we bring one journey to a close and prepare to begin a new one, let's delay for just a moment. Abide for just a moment so that we might walk alongside some of our ancient friends on a very familiar journey in the hope that we might be reminded about what the path looks like from death to new life. Today, friends, we will walk alongside two disciples as they make that familiar 7-mile journey toward Emmaus. Now, for those who didn't wear the right shoes or who are worried that they might slow down the rest of us, rest assured, we will take our time and be sure to stop frequently at each mile marker so that we might experience this journey from death to new life together. And so that we get started on the right foot, let us review our route. Our lesson today comes to us from the Gospel according to Luke, which is the only gospel to tell the story of the walk to Emmaus, a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem. This is the first story told after the discovery of the empty tomb. Jesus has yet to be seen, but it is still Easter Day, and that Easter promise is still alive. The story begins by telling us that 2 disciples were going to Emmaus and talking with each other about what had happened, which brings us to our first mile marker, mile 1, a walk. Now, to be honest, we have no idea why the disciples were heading to Emmaus. We don't know if there was something that they had to pick up or someone they had to see. We just know that they went for a walk and talked about all that had happened. And in our minds, that kind of makes sense. After all, we know what it's like to have something happen in our lives and feel like we need to get away in order to gain some perspective. And in those moments, a walk is not such a bad idea. Some of us remember doing that on September 11th. After having spent so much time glued to our television sets, we decided to get outside for some perspective. In other words, friends, when we feel ourselves stuck and unable to process what is going on in our life, like these disciples, maybe it's not such a bad idea to walk. To step away from the troubling situation, even if it's only for a moment. To gain some perspective. If nothing else, the activity reminds us that we are still alive. In this case, as the disciples walked along, we're told that they encountered a man whom we are told is Jesus, but whom they are said to not recognize. Which brings us to our second mile marker, mile 2, an encounter. One of the great things about being on a journey is that we never know who we are going to run into. Sure, sometimes they're familiar faces, but more often we encounter strangers as we go along. And though it can sometimes be awkward and scary, an encounter with a stranger is a way of reminding ourselves that life exists beyond us. That life exists outside of our realm of familiarity. If you've ever been to a rest stop on a highway, you'll know the feeling. There's a moment looking around at the people walking in and walking out when you think to yourself, is, friends, in life, encounters with those who are unfamiliar with us lead to growth. It's human nature to fear the other until we actually have a chance to interact with him or her. Perhaps the lesson for us then, beginning our journey after the death of Osama bin Laden, is to try and create opportunities to encounter the other. To spend time with our Muslim brothers and sisters in the hope that we might remember that they too are children of God. Because as our story reminds us, sometimes we get so blinded by our own issues that we don't realize who's right beside us. Which brings us to our third mile marker, mile 3, a sadness. When the disciples encounter this man, they don't say anything to him. They don't acknowledge his presence alongside of them until he butts into their conversation. He says, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" And when he asked this, we're told that they stopped. That they stood still and looked sad. They stood still and looked sad. There's something comforting about the idea that the disciples found themselves standing still, feeling sad, unable to move forward. After all, we know that when we are faced with an overwhelming situation, sometimes our impulse is to just stop, to not want to move forward out of fear of what comes next. We learn early in our life that our journey towards wholeness from death to new life comes in fits and starts. We feel like we're moving along and progressing nicely, but it often takes just one person asking some simple question for us to fall apart and feel like we can't move on. Here the disciples hear this stranger ask them what they're talking about, and they're stopped in their tracks, overwhelmed by sadness. But then somehow, they find the courage to say, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" Sometimes it feels like everyone should know everything that's going on in our lives. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days? To which Jesus responds simply, "What things?" Which brings us to our fourth mile marker, mile 4, an explanation. At some point, after a difficult event in our lives, we have to figure out how we are going to talk about it with the people around us. Sometimes we know that sometimes we know the right words, and other times they're harder to come by. In our story, the disciples found their words pretty quickly. Maybe they were just waiting to be asked, to have someone to talk to about it. Whatever it was, they went way beyond just telling him the events of these past few days to explaining in depth why they were upset about it. They had told them about their thought that Jesus was going to be the one to redeem Israel, the one to save them, the one to share their burden. And they expressed their confusion over the empty tomb. Do you see, somehow in the midst of their pain, they found a way to speak. In so doing, they offer us an example. Friends, we know from our own lives that it is often difficult to be honest enough with those around us to share why we are upset. Sometimes it's easier to do with strangers, but it is never easy. The lesson here is that it's only by finding a way to speak openly and honestly about a situation, by admitting the truth, that we can find our way finally towards life. Which brings us to our fifth mile marker, mile 5, a response. Jesus tells them that they're foolish for not seeing what was plainly called for in the prophets. And it goes on to explain all of the scriptures that referenced the Messiah's resurrection. Perhaps this was Luke's way of reminding the readers of the gospel that when we share the truth, we ought to be prepared for a response. And pray that it is an honest one, as hard as it is sometimes to hear. In this case, it was honest. But perhaps the lesson is that we can only hope for an honest response when we begin by speaking the truth ourselves. Friends, we speak honestly from our own situation in order to model the kind of honesty we expect back. And we can do this because we trust. We trust that God is present in those people we encounter, even the strangers, even when we are blind to it. Which brings us to our 6th mile marker, mile 6, an invitation. We're told that Jesus had said these things as they were nearing a village and went walking ahead, as if he was going to go on without them. Now, even though he's given them all this great advice, he's still a stranger, so it would make sense for him to go on along his way. But instead, they decide to stop him and to invite him to come and stay with them for the night. They say, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." And he stayed. Friends, the only way in which strangers become closer to us is through an invitation. The only way we can see hope, the only way we can hope to see God in those people around us, is by inviting them to be around us. This is who we are called to be as a church. It's what we mean when we say, "Feed more sheep," and it begins with an invitation to a common table in the hope that we might all be offered the bread of life. Which brings us to our 7th and final mile marker, mile 7, a meal. We have seen it over and over again throughout the gospel, as we have experienced it over and over again throughout our lives. There is something about sharing a meal with someone. There is something about breaking bread with someone that levels the playing field, that recognizes that whatever else we allow to divide us in the world, all of us have the same basic needs. Is it any wonder then that it was in the breaking of the bread that the disciples recognized Jesus' presence among them? Sometimes, friends, it's only when we set aside our differences and come to a common table that we can begin to see God in the people around us. And once we see it, once we recognize God in the other, like the disciples, we want to take to the streets and rejoice, not in death, but in life. Friends, it's fitting that we begin this new part of our journey towards life together on Mother's Day. After all, it's a day in which we celebrate those who bring us life. Sure, some of us have good experiences of our mothers, and others of us do not. But all of us survived the birth canal. And all of us started that journey of life. The trick is to keep going, even when death surrounds us. The good news, friends, is that we don't have to do it alone. Because of that, the Easter hope remains alive. Hallelujah.